Happy 250th birthday to the United States Marine Corps. A quarter of a millennia is a long time, but what you might not know is that the President's Own has been there for almost all of it. The band has developed and grown in lockstep with the Marine Corps and the United States as a whole. Today, I sit down with a couple of band members to talk about the history of America's oldest continuous musical group. Today, I'm joined by our first ever repeat guest. You might remember Master Gunnery Sergeant Mark Jenkins from our Recording Lab episode last year, but today he's here to talk with us about the band's history. Welcome back, Mark.
Thanks, Connor. Glad to be here.
And also here with us is the Marine Band historian and librarian extraordinaire, Staff Sergeant Philip Espy.
Hi there, Connor. Glad to be here.
All right, so Philip, let's just start off right at the beginning. How did the Marine Band get its start?
So the Marine Band was founded on July 11th, 1798. So that's the date where the Marine Corps was reestablished after the American Revolution. We look at that order by Congress that mentions the creation of a band of 32 fifers and drummers. That becomes the Marine Music Program. Some of those fifers and drummers went out into the fleet on ships with their comrades in the Navy. Other Marines stayed in Philadelphia, the capital city, and we trace our roots to those Marines who stayed in the capital.
And so, this was 1798. This was forever ago. We're America's oldest continuous musical group, and it was pretty early in America's history. Territories were still being established, and tensions with foreign powers weren't even settled yet. So you alluded to this just now, but what use did we have for 32 fifers and drummers?
So the reason for a musical unit within the military is for those military functions, right? I talked about this a little bit before, but how do you get a large group of people outside all doing the same thing? Rhythm is a great tool for that. You can have different rhythms on a drum to designate different movements or times during the day. Same thing with a fife, right? Those messages could go out to people because they were simply louder and more intelligible here than the human voice. So you have signals being carried by the musicians. But in 1798, there was also another problem. The problem of actually getting people to join the military of a new nation. And so the Marine Band kind of grows out of that tradition, right? So if we think about the signaling musicians going out into the fleet, which become our brothers and sisters in the fleet Marine bands around the world, and then you have folks in the capital city doing the work of recruitment. How do you get people talking about something or getting interested in something? You play some music. And so the Marine Corps had its music, and that becomes us. So you bring a federally funded musical ensemble like the Marine Band, and it becomes the de facto musical ensemble for the functioning of the federal government. What's interesting is that almost immediately, we become used for the same kind of entertainment concert uses when we arrive here in Washington, D.C.
And the only other reason is that we were the only musicians in town, really.
Oh, right, yeah.
There weren't very many anyone else, really, besides the Marine Band musicians. We were pretty much the only trained musicians, I think, in the area that we know of that actually had some experience. And so, like Philip was saying, the White House called upon us. The theaters of the era called upon us. Whenever a show would come to town, they would use the Marine Band to play the music for the plays. So we weren't just a military ensemble. We were kind of doing everything. And the other thing that is interesting at the time is that even though an act of Congress authorized the musicians of the Marine Band, they didn't really provide much for the pay of the musicians. And so, believe it or not, most of the pay that we got in those early days was from the pockets of the officers at Marine Barracks, Washington.
Oh, we just worked on tips?
Yeah, we worked on tips. So every time we would play a gig, the Marine officers would pony up, some change out of their pocket and give the members of the band. And even Thomas Jefferson, when he becomes president, he was very fastidious with his financial records. He would write down everything that he spent. Even if he just bought a book in the street, he'd write it down. There's several line items that he marked in saying, I paid the Marine Band $30 for this job. I paid the Marine Band musicians $20 for this job. So it was very early days, definitely, and we had a lot of growing to do for sure.
Well, it's nice to see the musician life of exposure and tips hasn't changed
Has
in
not
the past
changed
200-300
a bit.
years.
It's still the same, yeah.
But the Marine Band feels like it's sort of getting into the realm of being the president's band here. Your mention of Thomas Jefferson. Philip, how did that come about? How did we become the President's Own? How did we get that nickname?
As Mark was saying, we really were some of the few musicians in the area. I think we know of a couple bands in Alexandria existing, but when we see a mention of a band with the federal government, at this point, we've pretty much assumed that it was us. Our first appearance at the White House, we know for sure through diary entries, contemporary diary entries, that the Marine Band played at the White House as early as July 1801. The Marine Band is pretty sure, and we're still looking for that, actual document that places us there. We're pretty sure that we were there at the White House for New Year's Day, 1801, for the Adamses. Later on that year, so Thomas Jefferson had his inauguration, and one of the ways the Marines as a whole were looking to ensure its existence was to get with the new Republican government of Thomas Jefferson. Knowing that Thomas Jefferson loved music, the Marine Band was a huge part in making sure that the Marine Corps could still exist by having a really wonderful band to entertain Thomas Jefferson. We are pretty sure, based on our association with the White House, that we began our history of playing presidential inaugurations with Thomas Jefferson's 1801 inauguration.
I would say also, too, just to butt in, I think one thing that Jefferson saw in the Marine Band, this is a guy who used to be the ambassador to France. So he saw the royal court musicians in France. He saw the power that music combined with pageantry and pomp and circumstance. He saw that can project soft power. He saw that was a definite plus for a state dinner or for an arrival, or for all of these events of state that the new president was in charge of, because the president is our head of state in the United States. So I think Jefferson, even looking at this kind of ragtag group of a Marine Band, which it was back then, maybe saw its potential. And so he loved music, obviously, so that was part of it. But I think he also saw the potential of a dedicated group of musicians that could provide music for high-profile state events, which I think is very important, and I think it foreshadows a lot of what the band was going to become in the future.
So he cared a lot about the quality of the band, too, seeing these French court musicians and all of these fancy, like you said, projecting soft power.
Sure.
What steps did he take to kind of attempt to improve the quality of the band from 32 fifers and drummers in a field?
Well, one thing he did, and this is a really interesting story, in 1803, so this is the time when the Marine Corps actually was fighting a war with the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean. So this is where we get from the shores of Tripoli in the Marines hymn. He talked to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, whose name was William Ward Burroughs at the time, and he said, look, we need some more trained musicians. I want European trained musicians, because again, we're talking about high profile events at the White House. We want the best music that we can get.
Yeah, there was no Juilliard
there
in America.
There was nothing
yet.
like that in
No.
America. They were all self-taught, So he talked to the commandant and he said, look, the American fleet is stationed in southern Italy, Naples, and in Sicily. The next time you go over there, we want you to see if you can recruit some Italian-trained musicians, because at that time, Italy was known for just really high-level musicianship and a lot of orchestras, because opera was the thing. And, of course, opera comes from Italy. And so he tasked a captain by the name of John Hall. So he went over there, and he actually found a man in Naples by the name of Gaetano Carusi. And Gaetano Carusi was a very well-respected musician. He was trained, and he also had his own band, 15 members strong. And somehow, probably with advanced pay promises, he convinced Gaetano Carusi that he wanted to come back and be a member of the Marine Band in the newly formed capital of Washington, D.C. And Gaetano Carusi convinced all of his his fellow musicians to come with him. Now, this wasn't just the musicians coming, mind you. This was their wives. This was their children. These were whole families jumping on this ship and heading back to D.C.
Traveling from Italy to the new America,
Yes.
Not a small thing in the early 1800s.
Didn't know the language. And the problem was is by the time they got there, there was a new commandant. And he didn't know anything about this trip. And so he said, well, I don't know anything about you guys. And they said, well, but we're U.S. Marines. And they said, well, we don't have money to pay you because the budget was so small. But they did keep them on. But it was very interesting. What they did is they created a separate band that they called the Italian Band. So there was the Marine Band and the Italian Band. And if you go back to newspaper articles from like 1804, 1805, and you see these big public soirees or dances, you'll see music provided by the Italian Band and the Marine Band. It's very odd, but they were separated for a while until they eventually started combining. One particular person in there, Venerando, I think that's how you pronounce his first name, Venerando Pulizzi, became the drum major of the Marine Band later. So he was one of the original Italian musicians that came over that actually stayed and became a leader of the Marine Band. Carusi got out, and he stayed in the area, and he actually opened up a saloon. Now, this wasn't just any bar. This was actually one of the first performing arts centers here in the nation's capital. And a lot of the first inaugural balls for the presidents happened at his establishment. A lot of famous musicians came through there, and in fact, it was run by the family until the 1860s. So even though some Italians said, we're out of here, a few stayed, and they actually contributed a lot, not just to the Marine Band, but to the whole cultural history of D.C., which is very important.
Sounds like the stimulus of trained Italian musicians really had its effect on the group.
Yes, absolutely it did. Yeah, sure.
So for the first 50 years or so of the band's history, things are mostly just getting settled. As the United States develops as a country, so too does the band as a musical institution. What changes happened in the mid-19th century for the band?
So the most important thing, Connor, that happened in the mid-19th century was really the installation of Francis Scala as the leader of the band in 1855. Scala was also an Italian immigrant. He was born and trained in his home country and joined the Navy. He came over from Italy and arrived in the United States and thought, I never want to be on a boat again. He eventually settled in Washington, D.C., and became a member of the Marine Band. As he rose through the ranks and eventually was installed as the leader of the band starts reflecting the music that Scala loved and reflected the music more indicative of the European classical tradition that he was a part of. So things like art song, arrangements of opera arias, arrangements of classical music tunes, specifically Western classical music. Those all became part of the repertoire of the Marine Band. So instead of just doing kind of this entertainment music or background music or ceremonial music or military signaling music, the Marine Band's repertoire starts reflecting kind of the art music traditions that are beginning to happen in the United States that are, obviously full-fledged back in Europe. It also sort of helped that our president at that time, coming up from there, Abraham Lincoln was also a great lover of classical music. And so you have these two forces of both the president and the leader of the Marine Band both looking to have the band be a concert ensemble. That really is where we start considering ourselves as not just leaders in the world of military music, but leaders as an artistic ensemble here in the United States.
I think that was one of Scala's goals, too.
Mm-hmm.
I think he really wanted to have that outlet, have the Marine Band become that. I think, and he lobbied for years to get us there. He was probably one of the most shrewd leaders we ever had politically. I think he He knew how to talk to the presidents. He knew how to insert the Marine Band into any event that might require music, but just basically talk it up so the president say, well, of course, we need the Marine Band there. And I think the greatest compliment that Scala got from the Lincoln administration when they first came in, this is right when the Lincoln administration started, is they sent a note to the Commandant of the Marine Corps saying, the Marine Band will report to the White House every morning, and we will give them their duties for the day. Now, if you're looking for a connection to the most powerful house in the land, I don't think you can do better than that command from the President of the United States. So Scala did his work very well. And I think throughout the Lincoln administration, we can, of course, talk more about that, him and Lincoln were very close. And I think both of them were good friends. And Lincoln, throughout the Civil War and all of the trauma that brought that man and that leader, I think the Marine Band was there as an outlet for him to enjoy and to take his mind off a lot of the serious matters that he had to think about.
So our leadership and our presidents seem to very much believe in the Marine Band as an artistic institution. How was this received by the general populace? Were we popular? Did we have fans? Did we have anyone who enjoyed this new direction of the Marine Band?
We did. The people in D.C. loved the Marine Band, and they were all opera crazy. They loved opera, and they thought that if you were cultured, that's what you listened to. You didn't listen to Yankee Doodle, though they liked listening to that. They wanted to hear opera, and of course, Scala was there. He wasn't a gifted composer, but he was a gifted arranger. He was a shrewd composer, so when he would write a waltz or a march or a quick step, it wasn't great, but he would always dedicate it to a congressman's wife, or he would dedicate it to the first lady, so he would always curry favor with different compositions. But what he was very good at is writing arrangements of the fashionable operas of the day. And so a lot of people enjoyed it. One in particular was the famous poet Walt Whitman. For those of you who don't know, famous American poet, very famous for his poetry collection, Leaves of Grass, that came out in 1855. Am I right about that? He actually came to D.C. and stayed for 10 years during the Civil War and afterwards. He came in 1862 because his brother was a member of the Union Army and he had been wounded. So Walt Whitman came down. He was in his 40s, I think, at the time, and just to be with his brother in the hospital. But the one place they could always count on seeing him was at the Marine Band concerts on Saturday nights at the South Lawn of the White House. And he would even write reviews of the Marine Band concerts. And I actually have one here from, I think, 1872. He says in this review, he says, "The gathering at the close of yesterday at the President's grounds to hear the Marine Band was even fuller and apparently afforded more enjoyment and showed more new faces than that a week ago. It deserves to be made a note of. Over 1,000 and perhaps nearly 2,000 people, evidently the choicest class of fashionables, the young largely preponderating, with a full proportion of handsome women, rendezvous here in democratic style, in these turfy shades at the close of the week, in the cool, on the grass, under the trees, or by the fountain, to enjoy the best of music, given by one of the finest bands in the world, for the Marine Band is one of the finest." That's pretty high praise.
Not going to see that on Yelp.
No, not today.
It sounds like Scala is right up there with, John Philip Sousa as one of the most influential directors in the Marine Band's history.
The greatest achievement that Scala was able to broker with Congress and the president was the establishment of the Marine Band by an act of Congress in 1861, not only ensuring the growth of the band by its physical nature, but ensuring that the band would be compensated well into its future. So beyond the musical achievements that Scala had with the Marine Band, he also made sure that we were able to exist and grow and thrive as an organization by getting that act of Congress over the finish line as the director.
And one more footnote to Scala before we might move on. But one other thing he did was, as leader of the Marine Band, he oversaw the apprentice music program. So the apprentice musician program had been going on since the beginning of the 19th century. Basically, boys as young as 11 could come in, they would sign on the dotted line, and they would basically be enlisted and be trained by the leader of the Marine Band as either drummers or buglers or fifers. And in 1868, maybe 69, there was a young man from this area, from D.C. His father was a trombonist in the Marine Band, and he told his father one morning that he was going to run away and join the circus and be a musician. And his father said, "Oh, I don't think so." So his father went to his next-door neighbor, who just happened to be the commandant of the Marine Corps, and said, "What do I do with this kid?" And the commandant said, "Well, why don't you enlist him as a drummer boy in the Marine Band?" So this young man, this father took his young boy down, made him sign on the dotted line with Scala, and Scala became this young man's teacher. Well, this young man later became the leader of the Marine Band, and his name was John Philip Sousa.
And we'll get to more of that later. He's coming right up in our timeline of Marine Band history. We can't not talk about him. But we've been dancing around it a little bit, and during this time, the Civil War and everything that happened before and after it is going on. What did the Marine Band look like in that context? What was our interaction with those world events going on at the time, or definitely massive events in our history?
When I think about the Marine Band, I think of us as an institution that mirrors what's happening in the United States. And during wartime is when this is in greatest relief. During the Civil War, and as we go through the 20th century especially, we see the band doing a lot of work on the forefront, kind of keeping morale strong, defining the ideals of the nation through the music it plays. And by, sort of keeping on, helping the nation through the crisis and then through the healing process. For President Lincoln, the Marine Band was a really important part of his life. In his writings, President Lincoln talks about wanting so desperately to go out and listen to the Marine Band during their concerts on the White House lawn. He stops being able to do that during the Civil War, actually, and he writes very sadly about it, that if he were to make an appearance at the concert, he would have to make a speech, which he didn't want to do. So he spent many of the Marine Band concerts in one of the rooms of the White House with the curtains drawn and the windows open so he could at least hear the band, which was a balm to him and his family. One of the great treasures that we hold here at the Marine Band Library is actually a handwritten note from President Lincoln to the Marine Band. It's dated on February 4th, 1862, on this little slip of paper, and says, "Will the leader of the Marine Band call and see Mrs. L today? A. Lincoln." Which is just one of those very extraordinary, humanizing pieces of history that we get to think about and cherish here at the Marine Band.
The other thing that we have to mention when we're talking about the Civil War, of course, is the dedication of the National Cemetery at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, rather. So the Marine Band is tasked by Lincoln to go up with him. There was 3 other bands that went to this event. They took the train up from Washington, and they were there, as I said, to dedicate this new cemetery. This is several months after the battle had finished in November of 1863. Am I getting that date right?
And for those of us who might not know exactly what event we're talking about.
Battle of Gettysburg, yeah.
Right. 7 years ago.
That's the talk. So the Marine Band led the procession into the new cemetery where all the speeches were to take place. And of course, Lincoln famously got up and gave a 2-minute and something speech. It's very short, whereas the gentleman before him famously gave, I think it was 2 or 3 hours speech. It was a big contrast. And it was so fast that there's no pictures of it because the cameraman couldn't get the photo ready quick enough. And by the time he snapped the photo, Lincoln was sitting down. So that's the only photo we have, kind of a blurry Lincoln sitting back down after he finished the speech. But the story goes that on the way back, that Lincoln was surrounded by advisors giving him updates on the war, and he got so weary with this news that he made his way back to the car with the Marine band and spent the rest of the trip conversing with the members of the President's Own. So again, very close association with Lincoln, and it's something I think we're very proud of, for sure.
Now we come to one of the most defining moments of the Marine Band's history. In 1880, John Philip Sousa becomes our director. Now, John Philip Sousa's involvement with the Marine Band could be its entire podcast episode. It could be a 3-part miniseries. But can you tell us just a little bit for now about how Sousa changed the band?
So Sousa really saw the band as a professional ensemble. He's one of the first people who really invested in the rehearsal time and the discipline of making good music. On top of that, Sousa was writing the best music possible, right? There's no one that can write as good of a march as John Philip Sousa. With him becoming the director of the band starts its professional push to where we are now as one of the best musical ensembles in the entire world because of this focus on professionalizing the band. John Philip Sousa also brought the band to national and international attention. The Marine Band's national concert tour began under the leadership of John Philip Sousa. We have hit over 100 tours, I believe. And so that idea of getting the Marine Band out to the country as a whole is good not just for the band, for the people of those places to hear good music, but it really means that the Marine Band becomes a uniquely important American institution that goes beyond its roles here in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and it's interesting what he did with the march. So before John Philip Sousa was the leader of the Marine Band, marches were a very functional piece of music. So obviously, march, you do something for this, right? You walk for a certain amount of time, so you need a certain amount of music to fill the time. They weren't very interesting. As I said, they were functional. What John Philip Sousa did with a march is he actually made it this little mini story. So he started with an introduction, then he would have an A theme and a B theme, and then a very beautiful C theme, but then he inserted this different section that no one had ever done before. We call it the breakup strain. Some people call it the dogfight strain, but it's this section that basically is very harmonically disjunct. It's very marcato. It's very loud. You don't know where it's going to go. It's very dramatic. Usually it's in a minor key or even a diminished key or augmented. It's dissonant.
And for those of us familiar with the Stars and Stripes Forever, it's
perfect, yeah.
That part.
And you just don't know where it's going to go. There's no foreshadowing as to where it's going to happen. And so all of a sudden, he put this kind of dramatic development section into a march that it kind of took people off guard. And then all of a sudden, what happens after the dogfight? You come back to the beautiful aria theme again. So it's this little story that kind of has this arc to it. But that's why his marches were instantly popular. And this is completely out of his control, but the whole dance craze at the time was for the two-step. And someone realized that Sousa marches were perfect to dance the two-step to. And all of a sudden, the Washington Post, Semper Fidelis, all these marches became household names because boys and girls were dancing the two-step to it.
And some of his marches were arranged for piano, so a single piano
person.
player, could play Sousa's marches at home.
Oh, not just piano. What I love looking at old editions of Sousa music because, right, we are just getting to the point where recording technology becomes a thing. And yes, the Marine Band was a part of those very early recordings. The earliest we know were created before 1892, which did include Sousa's Washington Post March. But most people did not have access to music through recordings at that time. They had access to the music they could create themselves. So there are just fascinating editions of things like the Stars and Stripes Forever for things like a single banjo. But wait, you could also do a banjo duet. Do you have a zither at home? Would you like to play the zither version of Stars and Stripes Forever? So the music that was coming from Washington from John Philip Sousa, who did want to be as famous and considered as prominent as the English Gilbert and Sullivan or Johann Strauss Jr., known for not just his instrumental works, but his opera works. Sousa's music really was everywhere. When I give folks tours of the Marine Band Library and we talk about Sousa and his career, especially post-Marine Band with his civilian band, Sousa was like Taylor Swift. He sold out audiences all over the world, and scholars from all over the world are still getting in touch with us here at the Marine Band to find out more about Sousa's work. I just had a couple years ago, I was in conversation with a German musicologist who wrote a book about Sousa's tours of Europe and used our materials here at the Marine Band to support his research.
The band has a lengthy and storied history, but we don't want you to think it's all just dates and names. Sometimes history plays out like a TV drama. Mark, I think you have a Marine Band tale of love and murder?
Yes, I do. So this takes place between 1903 and 1907. So the director of the band at that time was William H. Sandelman. He was the second director after John Philip Sousa left the band in 1892. And at that time, that was what we call the golden age of bands. So John Philip Sousa, of course, had his famous band, which was the most famous band, but there were dozens of other bands touring. And a lot of them had brass soloists that were very famous. John Philip Sousa had the famous Italian euphonium virtuoso Simone Mantia. He had the cornet virtuoso Herbert L. Clark. Sandelman had a lot of good cornet players, but he needed a euphonium soloist. So he found a young man out in Chicago by the name of Ole May. It's an interesting name, O-L-E. I think it's Scandinavian, but Ole May. Very talented guy. So he was playing with Brooks' Chicago Marine Band, no relation to the service. They just stole the name Marine Band. And he, not only was he a fantastic euphonium soloist, but he was also a very talented pen and ink political cartoonist. In fact, he worked with newspapers all across the country, including the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Houston Chronicle, everywhere. This guy just kind of floated around with his talent, but he was a very good soloist, and so Sandelman hired him in 1903. So Ole May brought his wife and his 4 kids to Washington, D.C. Along with them came another musician that they had known in Chicago by the name of Lucien Conen, who was a French hornist, but also doubled on violin, which was very attractive to Sandelman because in the White House, inside, they didn't want the Marine Band so much anymore. They were favoring strings. So all the musicians in the Marine Band had to double on string instruments, which is something that happened, I think, up until the 1950s when they, thank heaven, stopped doing that. But so Lucien Conen was hired around the same time as Ole May. Well, Lucien and Ole May's wife were from the same state, Kentucky. In fact, I think they might have been from the same area. They knew the same people. So they were best of friends. Maybe a little too close. Because what would happen when Ole May would go solo with the Marine Band, and they lived right over here off of Pennsylvania Avenue next to the old Naval Hospital there, is that Jenny May would hang a white handkerchief in her window. And that was the signal for Lucien Conen to come by and have a drink with her in the parlor, let's say. And so this kind of went on for a few years until whispers started happening in the Marine Band that something was going on. And of course, this is Edwardian America. This is very, reputation was everything, a very high moral character. This was completely up beyond the pale. So Sandelman approached Lucien Conen about it, who at first denied it, but then unfortunately for Lucien, very unfortunately, threw Jenny May under the bus and said it was all her fault. She seduced him, and he was not at fault, and he had the letters to prove it. So, of course, when Jenny May found this out, she was extremely upset because, again, in those times, that was a serious serious accusation. So in 1905, I think in September of 1905, she waited for Lucien to come home from a Marine Band concert at the Capitol. He was walking back from the Capitol down 7th Street, just up the street from where we're at right now, coming back to the barracks, and she had a .32 caliber revolver in her hand. And just as he passed by, she shot him in the back.
Oh.
Yes. Now, what happened is that it was broad daylight too. I don't know how she thought she was going to get away with it, but she shot him in the back. Of course, there was a constable luckily nearby, grabbed her, took her into custody, and that's when everything really got crazy because it wasn't just a state crime because this is D.C. It was a federal crime. So a federal case started being hashed out in the newspapers regarding 2 members of the Marine Band, Olie May and Lucien Conan, with their shared love interest. And this was front page news. There's a clipping down in the Marine Band library of the graphic of the 2 Marine bandsmen in their uniforms and Jenny May in the middle of them. Very bad press for poor William Sandelman and the Marine Band. So to make a long story short, the trial dragged on. What was interesting is that Lucien did not pass away right away. They couldn't find the bullet. And in order to be charged with murder, it had to be within a year. So Lucien finally passed away, unfortunately, about 2 days after that year mark had passed. So they couldn't charge Jenny with murder. They charged her with, I think, deadly assault or something like that. But she got 10 years sentence in the women's prison up in West Virginia. Olie May stayed around in the band for about a year after that, but it was such a, traumatic thing that he eventually left. He still used to play with Sousa's band, though. Even after that, he would sub in a lot with Sousa's band until he passed away in 1917. But luckily, that press passed and the Marine Band kind of emerged unscathed. But that is the murder/assault, whatever you want to call it, story of 1905.
So we'll be taking bids from Netflix, Amazon Prime, maybe Hulu, just to tell that story.
It would make a great documentary for Netflix.
At some point in the 20th century, America becomes a world superpower. We find ourselves increasingly involved in historic world events, culture, and as a result, so too does the band. Philip, what role did the Marine Band have in the growing history of the United States?
So what's cool about thinking about the Marine Band's history is that the Marine Band sort of mirrors what's happening, and the Marine Band's growth mirrors what's happening in the United States as a whole. And this is especially true during the 20th century as America grows in its prominence around the world, particularly around World War II. We start seeing these enormous leaps in the band's virtuosity and its prominence as an ensemble around the world. Like we talked about with the Civil War, during these war times, both during World War I and during World War II, the Marine Band was extremely active in the Washington area, doing things like raising money through bond rallies and money for veterans and for the war pension funds. But there's 2 moments in that time period that I think is just really emblematic of how the Marine Band interacts with history, if not being the people that make history. One of which is on December 7th, 1941. The Marine Band went out for its normal workday that day. We sent an orchestra to the White House to support a luncheon that was being held at the White House. Interestingly enough, the Marine Band was in the White House providing services for the White House when the president received word that Pearl Harbor was attacked. And of course, all the things that happened from there. So we're there. We see the history happen. We're not making it, but we tend to be there.
And it's not just America's political history, but its cultural history as well. The band had a role in anything from the infancy of recording technology, as Mark talked about on a previous episode, to movies, biopics, and even having a small hand in shaping the Olympic opening ceremonies that we know today. Philip, could you talk about this just a little bit?
Yeah, so in terms of a biopic, in 1952, a film about the life of John Philip Sousa was released. It's called The Stars and Stripes Forever,
Of course.
obviously. And the Marine Band actually played the premiere of this movie. We went up to New York City for its big premiere. And what's fascinating about the film is that they did borrow Marine Band uniforms for the taping of this film. So it looks like us. When you mention the Olympics, we're thinking about 1960. 1960 was the Squaw Valley Olympics in California. And what's interesting about Squaw Valley was that its director of ceremonies was none other than Walt Disney. Walt Disney believed that the Olympics could have a little more pageantry than it did in the past. So you think about what just happened in Paris. That did not really happen before 1960 in the Squaw Valley Olympics. What better way to celebrate pageantry than bringing in the Marine Band? So we have photos from the Marine Band's trip up to Squaw Valley 1960 being the ensemble of the Olympics. We recorded all of the national anthems and performed a daily concert in Squaw Valley and all the medal ceremonies. So thank Walt Disney for this, and thank the Marine Band for this, for all the incredible showmanship that is now part and parcel of the celebration of an Olympiad.
And 227 years later, we're still here. What does the Marine Band look like today?
Mark mentioned the men of the band back in the 1930s, but we have celebrated over 50 years of women joining the Marine Band. Our first woman member of the band joined in 1973, and the Marine Band has grown to be expansive of the people of the United States. There are about 160 playing members of the band that are supported by 30 professional support staff members.
Such as yourself.
That's what we do down in that basement of the library. And we perform almost every day, over 1,200 services a year. And that includes things like a trumpeter playing taps for a funeral out in Arlington National Cemetery. It includes a solo violinist providing music for the president in the residence, up to the 99-piece band that we use at the inaugural parade. So we stay really busy making America's music in any way, shape, or form you could ever think of a musical ensemble to take. Like I said, a single player to a 100-piece band and everything in between.
You mentioned, Philip, that women joining the Marine Band, we're talking about this at the very end of the podcast, and when I think about something like that, just in my brain, it comes across to me as ancient history, but it's not. It was more recent than you would think, and I think it's important to point this out because, Mark, you were earlier off air telling me a story about meeting someone and talking with someone who remembers this and was there for this.
Yeah, so this was actually even before women were allowed to join the Marine Band. They were allowed to join the United States Marine Corps during World War II. And so what I was telling you about was the formation of the Women's Reserve Marine Band that happened during the war, and several Marine Band members were sent down to Norfolk. I believe it was Norfolk. If I'm wrong, Philip, just correct me. To help organize this band, and it was a completely female ensemble, and they sounded unbelievable. They toured around the entire United States, and they finished their tour right here at Marine Barracks, Washington, with a Dream Hour broadcast with music completely by that ensemble. And just a couple years ago, when the Marine Band was on tour, I met one of the euphonium players, a beautiful lady in her 80s who was in that band. And it was such an honor for me to meet a trailblazer like that, a person who had immense talent and who had been given an opportunity to provide music in that way that I've been provided and had such a history in that. In 1973, as Philip mentioned, women were allowed to enter the band. And 50 years on, it's obviously been a legacy unto itself.
1973 is the year I believe my parents met. And I think, they remember that. So it's just more recent than you would imagine.
Yes.
I believe about a third of our membership is women right now, which I think is wonderful to see. And
I also think, too, that aside from the makeup of the band, the the music that the band plays is also indicative of America. In 1854, when Scala was writing his transcriptions, there wasn't a whole lot of American music to speak of. And now look, after the full 20th century, we have all of the popular music styles. We still do classical, we have jazz, we have all of these things that we can draw upon depending on what event that we're playing for, what audience that we're playing for. So as America's musical diversity has grown, so has the Marine Band's musical diversity. I think that's really an important key thing to underline, that the Marine Band, as Philip was saying, is a reflection of the culture that we have here in America. We're current, but we're also a very important reminder of the past. And of course, as this is a podcast about the history of the band, the Marine Band is really the last link of John Philip Sousa and of that era that's still around. And I think one thing that I'm very proud of in the Marine Band is the style that we play the marches in. If you listen to an old wax cylinder recording from 1892 of the band playing Semper Fidelis, you'll hear a lot of similarities to how the band plays Semper Fidelis today. And there's nothing written down. It's just that oral tradition that has been passed from one generation of musicians to the next. And that's exciting.
And if you're interested in that topic, just a little plug here, an earlier episode of the Marine Band, I sat down and talked with their previous director, Colonel Jason Fettig, who talks a lot about producing the Marine Band sound and recording John Philip Sousa marches. Philip, Mark, thank you so much for joining me today. But before we go, what do you think the band will look like in another 227 years in the year 2253?
Well, we'll still be wearing the same uniforms. I'm pretty sure that's true. But
still wool too, right? Hot and wool?
Yes, absolutely. But if there's an institution in this country that keeps on keeping on, it's us. And I think in over 200 years, we'll still be celebrating American music and music from around the world in a respectful, virtuosic, to the highest standards way that is and will always be the hallmark of the Marine Band, the way we look, but even more importantly, the way we sound.
Well, I just hope we have flying saxophones.
Oh boy.
Philip, Mark, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thanks, Connor.
Thanks, Connor.
This episode was written by Gunnery Sergeant Connor Mikula, produced by Gunnery Sergeant Joe Cradler, and edited by Staff Sergeant Stephen Rudman. Recorded in John Philip Sousa Band Hall at Marine Barracks, Washington, D.C.